Witness the brutal, televised destruction of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, carefully manufactured working-class persona, as Secretary Marco Rubio deploys a single, battered plastic name tag to trap Washington's loudest politician in an inescapable, paralyzing silence. The congressional hearing chamber was stuffed heavily beyond its legal capacity. The political rumor mill had been churning overnight. The Secretary of State was scheduled to testify, and Ocasio-Cortez had practically guaranteed her allies she was going to publicly dismantle him on live television. 3 major news networks had their camera tripods stacked aggressively along the back wall. The spectator gallery was overflowing right up to the brass handrails, and completely ignored in the very back row, pressed against the wall where federal marshals usually demand a clear path, sat an elderly man with his hands quietly folded in his lap. They were the thick, heavily calloused hands of a lifelong blue-collar laborer, hands that had physically carried weight to survive. He held them with the distinct, weary posture of a man who had spent 40 grueling years standing on his feet, a harsh reality his spine had never fully forgotten. He had driven an incredibly long distance just to sit in that specific folding chair. Absolutely nobody in the room knew his identity, and nobody would know until the absolute bitter end. Marco Rubio walked into the chamber with zero theatrical fanfare. He silently placed a tiny, unidentifiable object face down on the polished wooden desk in front of him, poured a glass of water for his aide before pouring his own, and simply waited. That little plastic object rested there face down the entire morning, and not a single camera or reporter gave it a second glance. When the committee chairman officially yielded the floor, Ocasio-Cortez seized the microphone like a politician picking up a heavily practiced weapon. She completely ignored international foreign policy. She ignored the State Department budget she was technically sitting there to discuss. She aimed her crosshairs straight for what she had calculated to be his softest personal vulnerability. "Mr. Secretary," she began, a theatrical, condescending half-smile already locking into place. "I want to talk about the story, because you have a story. We have all heard the story. The bartender father, the maid mother, the little boy who miraculously made it. It's a beautiful story. It really is." She let a heavy, dramatic beat drop. "It's a bedtime story, and I think you tell it so often and so effectively, specifically so that you never ever have to vote like a man who actually lived it." A noticeable sound shifted through the packed gallery, not a laugh, but something significantly colder and sharper. "And I'll be brutally honest with you," she continued, slowly and deliberately twirling an expensive pen between her fingers. It was a smooth, idle motion, the deeply arrogant gesture of someone who had never once lost a public confrontation. "There are people out there, millions of them watching right now, who hear that story, and they mindlessly clap. They would much rather clap for a nice, heartwarming story than read a single page of a complex policy brief. They mistakenly think a hard luck tale is the exact equivalent of a healthcare plan. It isn't. It never was." She leaned back into her leather chair, projecting total dominance. "I represent where this country is actually going. The people who clap for your little bedtime story represent exactly where it's been. So let's not sit here and pretend this is a conversation between equals." She had just deliberately insulted, on live national television, the exact working-class demographics leaning heavily into their screens across Florida, Ohio, and every single part of New York that refuses to vote for her. She did it with a smirk, fully convinced her political missile had landed cleanly, and it had landed just nowhere near the target she intended. If you have ever been arrogantly talked down to by someone who has never missed a meal in their life, someone completely convinced your existence is simpler than theirs, violently smash that like button right now. Because the sweeping insult she just delivered out loud was meant directly for you, and she absolutely meant it. Stay with me. Watch exactly how he responds. Marco Rubio didn't even blink. He let her completely finish her monologue. He let the thunderous applause she clearly expected completely fail to materialize. He let the suffocating, dead silence following her statement stretch a half-second too long, and then another painful half-second past that, until veteran reporters in the gallery genuinely began to wonder if he was going to answer her at all. And then he executed a countermove she was entirely blind to. He thanked her. "Congresswoman," he replied, and there was absolutely zero edge or anger in his voice. None at all. "Thank you for that. I genuinely mean it. You just opened the exact door I was praying somebody would open today." He neatly folded his hands together on the desk. The small plastic object still lay face down, totally unremarkable, and he didn't reach for it yet. "Before we proceed any further, though, I want to be absolutely sure I understand you perfectly, because you said something deeply important just now, and I absolutely do not want to put words in your mouth." He stared directly at her across the divide, his demeanor as calm as deep water. "You stated that you represent working people. I'm just going to ask you a very plain question, and you can answer it however you see fit. What exactly is it that makes a person part of that class? Is it doing the actual, physical work, or is it just being incredibly good at talking about it?" Ocasio-Cortez, a politician who had never in her life been able to resist a question that flattered her ego, walked blindly and enthusiastically straight into the trap. "It's living it," she snapped back, genuine heat rising in her chest because she believed this was her untouchable territory. This was the exact narrative where she always felt safe. "I was a bartender. I waited tables. I worked grueling, endless doubles on my feet, until my back physically gave out, surviving with zero health care, exactly the way millions of Americans do every single day. I didn't read about that brutal life in a sterile policy brief. I actually lived it, and I brought that desperate work ethic, that exact memory, right into this Congress with me. That is exactly what makes me one of them. I earned it." "That's a very good answer," Rubio stated with chilling quietness. "I mean that too. So let's get it cemented on the official record, nice and clear. Doing the grueling work is what officially makes a person one of them. You said it. You're fiercely proud of it. You personally picked that exact definition just now with the entire country watching." "I did." "Good." He nodded slowly, folding his hands a fraction tighter. "Hold on to that, Congresswoman. Hold on to it real tight. We're going to desperately need it later." She didn't realize it yet, but the steel vault door had just slammed completely shut behind her, and she had willingly walked through it with a smile on her face. He still avoided the plastic object. Instead, he smoothly transitioned to his next surgical strike. "You talk constantly about where you grew up," Rubio noted. "You frame it better than almost anybody in politics. Zip code is destiny, you repeatedly tell people. The specific street you're born on permanently decides the rest of your life. And I believe that. I've personally seen it be true, so I just want to visually picture it with you for a brief second." He tilted his head, his tone almost empathetic. "When you were a little girl doing your homework at night, where was your father? Was he in the house?" She blinked rapidly, totally thrown off balance. This wasn't the aggressive policy attack she had heavily braced for. He was. "He was home?" she stammered, the absolute certainty draining from her voice. "He was around. He was home." Rubio nodded, exactly like a detective simply filing a minor detail away. "What did that specific street look like? The one you did your homework on? Were there front yards? Fences?" "I fail to see what my childhood landscaping has to do with the federal State Department budget," she aggressively deflected, prompting a thin, highly nervous laugh from her political allies in the room. "You're completely right. Humor me, anyway. Were there fences?" A heavy, agonizing pause. "There were yards," she admitted, instantly defensive. It was a quiet street, with green yards, and your dad came home at night, and the lights were still on when he got there. He delivered the summary without a single drop of malice, which somehow made it infinitely more devastating than malice. Yorktown Heights. That's the town. I looked it up early this morning, not to embarrass you, just to truly understand you. It's a remarkably fine place. A very safe, good place to raise a child. Most struggling, desperate families in this country would sacrifice absolutely everything to put their kids on that quiet street with the green yards and the fences. I am incredibly proud of where I'm from, she fired back hotly. And I have never once hidden. I'm not accusing you of hiding it, Rubio interrupted, raising his palm just slightly to halt her momentum. I'm getting at something much simpler than that. Here is my only question, and then I will immediately move on. This was the absolute first time all morning he let anything deeply personal bleed through his stoic armor, and he allowed exactly one sentence of it to show. Absolutely no more. In my house, nobody could have possibly answered the question I just asked you, because at that hour, my father wasn't home yet, and he wouldn't be home until I had already been fast asleep for hours. He let that brutal, unfiltered reality sit for one beat. Just one. Then he pulled back, exactly like a man stepping away from a blazing fire he didn't want to warm his hands at too long. That's all. I just wanted you to hear exactly how a different version of that childhood actually sounds. The chamber had gone terrifyingly quiet. Now the air felt physically heavy. So I don't fault you for the quiet street, Congresswoman. I want to be perfectly clear about that. I would never fault a person for growing up somewhere safe and comfortable. His voice remained completely level. What I am trying to understand is something entirely different. Why you felt you had to put that beautiful street away. Why a privileged woman who grew up comfortably in Yorktown spent years intentionally letting people secretly believe she came up hard in the gritty streets of the Bronx. Because here is the ugly, unforgiving truth about that: the people who actually came up hard in the Bronx, the ones working the brutal double shift on their aching feet right now, while we sit comfortably in these plush leather chairs, they heard you proudly claim you were one of them. And they blindly believed it. And they voted exactly like they believed it. You borrowed their painful life. You won a powerful election with it. He paused, letting the silence crush the room. And then you kept the powerful seat, and they kept the double shift. He absolutely did not look at the camera once while he delivered the kill shot. He completely didn't have to. Somewhere out there, a blue-collar worker who had just clocked off that exact grueling shift was hearing his own forgotten life validated in a federal hearing room by a man who wasn't even looking his way. She had hijacked a harder life than the one she actually lived, just to gain the absolute trust of the people drowning in it. If that reality lands somewhere deep for you, type the word borrowed in the comments right now. Then, stay right here, because she is about to violently swing back, and her first counterattack is absolutely ruthless. Ocasio-Cortez violently locked her jaw. She had survived this dangerous terrain before. She instinctively deployed her ultimate, heavily practiced defense mechanism whenever the floor collapsed beneath her. She aggressively changed what the entire fight was even about. "I know exactly what this is," she declared, her voice surging with its old commanding volume, rising and absolutely certain. "Let's accurately name it for the cameras. This is a highly powerful man, a sitting Secretary of State, sitting up there telling a brown woman she simply isn't poor enough, isn't authentic enough, isn't Latina enough to have a legitimate voice in this room. You want to audit my childhood? You, of all people? A man who came from a struggling immigrant family and then spent an entire political career pulling the ladder up right behind him, voting directly against the very desperate people your own parents used to be?" Her eyes were burning with genuine fury now. You absolutely do not get to lecture me about authenticity, Mr. Secretary. Not you. Not to me. And for a fleeting, electric moment, give her the credit she deserves, the entire room fully shifted back to her control. It was a flawless, devastating political punch. It had connected perfectly in 100 different rooms, and the political muscle memory was still deeply ingrained in her delivery. The reporters' pens blurred frantically across their notepads. The loyal staffer standing behind her aggressively nodded twice. A woman near the front row, who had been highly skeptical moments ago, suddenly dropped her gaze in total shame. The momentum was entirely hers again. It held, and you could physically feel the programmed instinct sweep through the chamber. Like sudden weather, the deeply trained reflex to instantly back away from an identity-based accusation rather than directly address the logic hiding beneath it. It held for exactly 20 seconds. It might have held indefinitely. But Rubio completely refused to flinch. He completely refused to apologize, and he absolutely refused to do the cowardly thing the accusation was specifically designed to force him to do. Instead, he did two incredibly subtle things. Neither of them was loud. First, he spoke directly to her in fluent Spanish. It was a brief sentence, just a handful of words, delivered low and completely even. He didn't immediately translate it for the English-speaking room. He simply said it. And then he patiently waited. Then he asked her in English, "Did you follow that?" She hesitated. It was only a microscopic fraction of a second. But in a dead silent room, a fraction of a second feels exactly like an eternity. And absolutely everyone heard the stumble. He didn't smirk at her hesitation. He didn't exploit the glitch. That was his deadliest tactic. He gave her absolutely zero cruelty to push back against. "I'm not doing that to catch you out," he said with genuine gentleness. "I would never weaponize a man's own native language to publicly shame him, and I absolutely won't do it to you. I only said it because of exactly where my father learned his English. He learned it standing behind a loud, sticky bar, one brutal word at a time, entirely off of men who left him tips and pure contempt in equal measure. Men who spoke to him agonizingly slowly because they arrogantly assumed he was mentally slow. So I know exactly what it feels like to have your core identity held up and manipulated as a cheap political prop. I just categorically refuse to reach for mine the second an argument starts going against me. That is the only difference I am pointing out today." And then, the second devastating thing happened, and it didn't even come from his side of the aisle. Further down the dais, a congresswoman leaned slowly toward her own microphone. She was a staunch Democrat. She had voted in total lockstep with Ocasio-Cortez more times than anyone could successfully count. She was also Latina. She had been sitting completely silent through the entire explosive hearing, her hands tightly folded. When she finally spoke, it was in the exhausted, careful tone of someone who had been internally debating whether to intervene and had finally made her choice. "Let me add one brief thing," she stated flatly, "and then I will go back to being quiet. Do not put that specific card on the table just to save yourself from a bad morning. Some of us are forced to carry that word every single day, in rooms significantly less friendly than this one, and we never, ever have to hold it up over our heads like a shield in the absolute middle of a debate we are clearly losing." She paused, letting the friendly fire burn into the record. "When you do that, you make the word weigh significantly less for the rest of us. You turn it into a cheap political move instead of an actual life. So please, put it down. It absolutely does not belong in your hand right now." Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth, then completely closed it. The defensive shield had utterly failed to deploy. The momentum that had been completely hers a moment ago instantly reversed itself without a single loud noise. A senior member of her own political party had just publicly ordered her to put the identity card away because she was cheapening it for the people who actually carry it for real. If you have ever watched an arrogant politician blindly reach for their identity to dodge accountability for what they actually did, you know exactly what just transpired in that room. Subscribe to this channel right now, because this stopped being about a childhood zip code a long time ago. It's about a deeply hypocritical pattern, and that pattern is about to get significantly harder to watch. Rubio let the heavy silence breathe. Then, he reached still, not for the plastic object, not yet, but for his next surgical strike. "I want to ask you about a specific dress," he stated. A highly nervous laugh rippled through her side of the chamber. "A few years back, you wore a custom gown to an elite gala in New York, a white gown, and splashed across the back of it in massive red letters were 3 words, 'Tax the Rich.'" He read the infamous slogan plainly, exactly the way someone reads a traffic sign. Now, the basic ticket to even get inside that particular party started at $35,000 a seat. "So, I'm not going to interrogate you about the dress. I'm going to ask you about the table." He stared at her, completely unbothered. "Who exactly did you sit with that night, Congresswoman? Read me a few of the billionaire names at your table." She immediately started to deflect, rapidly rambling about the deep symbolism, about sparking a vital national conversation, about the grand political strategy of the stunt. "I didn't ask what the dress meant," Rubio interrupted, not unkindly. "I asked exactly who was at the table, because I think I already know, and I think the millions of people watching know too." He let the crushing quiet stretch out. "Those specific names, the elite ones sitting at that $35,000 table eating that gourmet dinner with you, those are the exact billionaires you constantly go out and instruct working-class folks to despise. And you wore their punishment on your back, right in the middle of their lavish dinner, like a piece of high-end jewelry. And then, you simply went home." He let one devastating beat fall. And right here, he did the only thing all morning that came close to speaking past her. And he executed it without ever once uttering the word audience or voters, and the desperate people who blindly believed you. The struggling ones who mailed you $20, they couldn't actually afford to lose. They didn't get to go to the elite party. They stayed right where they were, stuck with the empty slogan, but totally without the dinner. He tilted his head slightly. "Has that designer slogan paid a single one of their past due electric bills yet, Congresswoman? Just one. Give me one name. Give me one working-class person whose crushing rent got paid by the red words on the back of your dress." He waited. She did not give him a name, because there was no name to give. "There were working people actively serving that dinner too," he noted, his voice growing softer. "Carrying the heavy trays between those elite tables while you sat comfortably at one of them wearing the dress. They were forced to wear a uniform to be allowed inside that room. You wore a costume, and I would bet you absolutely everything in my pockets that not a single one of those servers could have made their monthly rent based on what your ticket cost, even though a billionaire paid for yours." He let the brutal contrast settle. "Those are your people, Congresswoman. Or they were supposed to be. They were physically closer to you that night than any billionaire you sat down with. And you literally had your back to them the entire evening, displaying 3 red words, telling them exactly who they should be angry at. Out there, somewhere far past the television cameras, every single person who had never once been invited into a $35,000 room quietly placed themselves inside the word them. Nobody instructed them to. They just instinctively did. That is a gross distortion of a symbolic gesture." "It's just a photograph, Congresswoman," she desperately fired back. The entire room completely broke. Not a polite, muffled giggle this time, but a real, rolling, utterly helpless roar of laughter. The contagious kind of laughter that entirely hijacks a crowd and absolutely refuses to give control back. The kind that exponentially builds on itself because people start laughing partly at the sheer absurdity of her excuse and partly at each other for losing their professional composure. A man near the front desperately took his glasses off just to wipe tears from his eyes. A reporter sitting in the second row caught himself laughing on live camera, bit down painfully on his lip to stop, but his shoulders just kept violently shaking anyway. And tucked in the very back row, the old man with the calloused workman's hands absolutely did not laugh. He just nodded once, very slowly, like a man hearing something completely true that he had waited a lifetime to hear someone finally say out loud. If you have ever watched an arrogant politician get caught dead to rights and attempt to use a $10 word to climb back out of the hole, share this video with one person who would deeply understand it, then come right back, because she is about to take her absolute hardest swing of the entire morning, and you need to see it, because it almost miraculously works. She took the shot. Give her that credit to the very bitter end, she absolutely did not go down quietly. She yanked the microphone closer and came back at him low, incredibly fast, and furious. And it wasn't nothing, because the exact thing she reached for was undeniably true. You want to talk about the actual work? She spat. Fine. Let's talk about the work. I worked grueling doubles that would have you sobbing in the walk-in fridge halfway through your very first shift. I physically carried heavy trays, while entitled men, exactly like you, sat in plush leather chairs and decided my tips weren't a real job. I stood on my aching feet until I couldn't feel them anymore, surviving with zero health insurance for years, and I absolutely did not complain. I ran for Congress, so do not sit up there in your expensive suit and lecture me about manual labor. I have lived more of it than this entire committee combined. I earned every single word I say about it, and it was phenomenal. For a brief, electrifying moment, it was genuinely masterful. Real heat instantly flooded back to her side of the room. A pen or two stopped moving in the press gallery. The momentum noticeably wavered. Rubio patiently let her finish. He let the entire passionate speech land. And then, for the absolute first time that morning, he slowed his tempo all the way down. All the remaining warmth completely drained out of him, replaced not by anger, but by something significantly flatter, much more level, and infinitely harder to look away from than rage. He asked her one final question, and his voice was terrifyingly quiet. How long? She blinked, stunned. What? How long did you actually do it? He pressed softly. Before it miraculously became a catchy line on a campaign flyer, before it became the dramatic thing you scream at political rallies, the bartending, the heavy trays. How long, really? A year? A couple of summers? She started to answer, but the words totally jammed in her throat. They didn't come out cleanly, because the honest, factual version of the answer was incredibly short, and every single person breathing in that room could instantly feel that it was short. The deafening silence occupying the exact space where a proud number should have been screamed said infinitely more than any specific number ever could have. And that was the exact moment Marco Rubio finally reached for the small plastic object resting on the desk. He slowly turned it the rest of the way over. He deliberately slid it a few inches across the wood toward her, pushing it into the open space in the middle of the table where the network cameras could clearly verify its existence, even if they couldn't read the tiny text. It was a standard-issue name tag, severely yellowed by time, incredibly soft at the corners, and worn completely pale, right where a thumb had repeatedly rubbed it for decades. It featured one single name, and directly underneath it, two more words, Mario, Banquet Service. The man who proudly wore this, Rubio stated, his voice devoid of emotion, did the exact brutal work you are describing for 30 years. Not a couple of brief summers. 30 years. He came home at 3 o'clock in the morning with the stale smell of other people's lavish parties permanently baked into his clothes, his feet horrifyingly swollen. He stood behind that bar for so long that the veins in his legs completely gave out. And he never, not one single time in his entire life, went on national television to whine to anybody about it. He pushed the battered tag exactly 1 inch closer to her. He is not here today. Has gone. But there are men exactly like him sitting directly behind you in this room right now. And they just listen to you proudly call the brutal lie of "they are still desperately living," a catchy line you slapped on a flyer just to win an election. He still didn't raise his voice. He hadn't raised it a single time all morning. You said it yourself, Congresswoman, 40 minutes ago, with the entire country watching. Doing the work is what makes a person one of them. You confidently picked that rule. So let's hold your resume up to the harsh light, just this once. And then he delivered the ultimate kill shot. 11 devastating words that flawlessly accomplished what 10,000 never could have. They wore the uniform, you wore the slogan. Absolutely nobody laughed at that strike. It didn't land as a joke. It landed deep in the terrifying, permanent part of a room where political careers are permanently decided and can never be undecided. Ocasio-Cortez's hand had been constantly moving the entire morning. The pen, the smooth, arrogant, idle twirling of it between her fingers. Around and around. The signature gesture of a politician who had never once lost a public fight. She startled. The pen violently slipped. It broke loose from her trembling fingers and dropped onto the wooden desk. But it didn't just fall. It rolled. It rolled in a slow, agonizingly unhurried arc across the polished wood, exactly the way a dropped object rolls in a room that has gone completely, terrifyingly silent. Every single camera lens in that chamber physically tracked its movement. It traveled across the open space in the middle of the table and finally came to a complete stop, resting directly against the edge of the yellowed name tag. It made a tiny, flat click. The highly sensitive microphones easily caught the sound and broadcasted it out across the dead-quiet room. An expensive pen touching a working-class name tag. That was the absolute only sound existing in the silence. It was absolutely deafening. She did not pick the pen up. She just stared at it lying there. This ordinary, expensive pen coming to a permanent stop against an old immigrant's yellowed name. And then she slowly drew her hand back into her lap, tightly folded it over her other hand, and she said absolutely nothing at all. The chairman awkwardly cleared his throat into the suffocating quiet and formally asked whether the gentlewoman wished to respond. She completely declined to respond. That specific sound, an expensive pen rolling to a dead stop against a battered name tag in a room so terrifyingly quiet, you could have heard a pin drop that is the exact sound of a political career permanently changing its trajectory on live television. If that historic collapse gave you literal chills, turn on notifications right now, so you absolutely do not miss what happened after the network cameras finally shut off. Because the physical room emptied out. But the brutal story definitely did not. Stay with me. By the time the hearing concluded, the devastating clip already had a viral name, and the internet was absolutely merciless to her. Someone had cleanly snipped the final 40 seconds. The brutal question, how long, really? The deafening silence occupying the exact space where a number should have proudly been. The yellowed name tag sliding across the desk. The pen rolling, and finally coming to rest against Mario, Banquet Service, with that tiny, fatal click. By mid-afternoon, it was physically impossible to scroll for 10 seconds on any screen in the entire country without the execution loop surfacing again. And here was the terrifying element that should have frightened her the absolute most. Assuming she could feel anything beyond the burning humiliation radiating in her face. The internet wasn't even arguing about it. They weren't debating tax brackets, or the elitist Met Gala, or who was or wasn't authentically Latina, or any of the massive geopolitical things she desperately wanted that morning to be about. There was absolutely zero debate left to have. Millions of Americans were just watching a shiny pen roll across a table and touch an old man's forgotten name over and over again on an endless loop, and falling completely silent when it did. The primetime evening broadcasts universally led with the brutal freeze frame, the dropped pen, the yellowed name tag, her empty hand already pulled back in defeat into her lap. One major network ran the footage under a devastating banner that featured nothing but 7 words printed in stark white letters on a black background. Zero political commentary was added, because absolutely none was needed. The brutal words did the heavy lifting. The humiliating picture finished the execution. Out in the marble hallway right outside the chamber, a hungry reporter ambushed a Democratic congressman who had loyally voted with Ocasio-Cortez plenty of times over the years. He flatly refused to let his name be published. He nervously checked both ends of the corridor. First, the exact paranoid way insiders in Washington always do, before leaking a devastating truth. Then he whispered it anyway, keeping his voice incredibly low and fast. "Everybody saw this exact disaster coming," he confessed. "Everybody. You simply cannot politically perform the working class in front of a man who actually grew up drowning in it, and you sure as hell cannot do it in front of the desperate people who are still living it while they sit there and watch you use their pain." He shook his head grimly. There is no PR statement in the world that magically walks that back. Shall spend the entire week learning that the hard way. And then he vanished down the hall, before the voice recorder could even be raised. And the old man with the calloused workman's hands drove home. It was an incredibly long drive, the exact same grueling drive he had made coming up that morning. And he did not turn the truck's radio on for a single second of it. He absolutely didn't need to. He had gotten exactly what he came for. Somewhere out past the city limits, with the dark highway endlessly unspooling in his headlights and absolutely nobody in the world watching him do it, he reached deep into his faded shirt pocket. He carefully took out a small object and gently set it on the passenger seat right beside him. It was a plastic name tag, severely yellowed at the corners, worn completely pale right where a thumb had repeatedly rubbed it for 40 grueling years. His own forgotten name, printed on his own tag, from his own 40 years standing behind a loud hotel bar in Florida. The exact kind of brutal job a person does until their broken body remembers the pain forever. He absolutely did not cry. He was not a man who cried easily, but he had to violently pull the heavy truck onto the gravel shoulder for a minute. He just sat there in the dark, with the engine loudly idling, staring at his own name resting on the seat beside him. Because for the absolute first time in longer than he could possibly remember, a powerful man in a room he would never be allowed into had said a name exactly like his out loud, and he had spoken it like it weighed just as much as an elite Ivy League diploma. 40 years he had stood trapped behind that sticky bar. He had carried impossibly heavy trays for arrogant senators, pampered movie stars, and elites whose faces he recognized from glossy magazines. And not one of them, not a single one, had ever once bothered to ask him his name. He had poured expensive drinks for politicians, who casually talked about working folks the exact same way they talked about the weather, like an abstract concept that only happens to other people far away. And he had politely smiled, perfectly crafted the drink, and limped home at 3 o'clock in the morning with his feet literally on fire. And he had never said a single word of complaint, because shutting up and serving was the job. And tonight, in a federal hearing room he would never, ever be allowed to step foot in, a powerful man had held up a plastic tag exactly like the one resting on his seat, and had absolutely refused to let it be small. He sat there in the dark until he could see the road straight again. Then he pulled the heavy truck back onto the highway and drove home to a brutal life that some arrogant elites in Washington apparently thought was just a cute bedtime story. And Marco Rubio? For his part, he did the exact thing he had done all morning, which was almost nothing at all. He calmly picked up the yellowed name tag He wiped it once with his thumb, the old, soft, instinctual motion of a man who had proudly done it 1,000 times before. He slid it deep into the inside breast pocket of his suit jacket, right over his chest where he had carried it in. And then he stood up and walked out of that chamber without uttering one more word to anybody. He completely ignored the flashing cameras. He bypassed the frantic reporters, screaming his name down the hall. He walked right past the empty chair where the loudest, most aggressive woman in Congress had finally, after all these years, run completely clean out of things to say. He had gotten exactly what he came in for. It fit neatly in a single pocket. It always had. If this incredibly powerful story reached you even once, physically press that like button, so the algorithm pushes it to more people who desperately needed to hear it today. If you believe somebody finally spoke up for the invisible people who stand behind the bar, who carry the heavy trays, who limp home at 300 inches the morning, and never once go on national television to whine about it, then subscribe to this channel right now. Leave one word in the comments. Just one. Type the word uniform. Share this with somebody who would feel the justice in their bones, because the absolute loudest thing in that entire room, in the bitter end, was a shiny pen rolling to a dead stop against an old working man's name. And some things, it turns out, absolutely do not need a second page.